Good morning. And I'll carry off or start here. A great presentation by Kurt, and some of what we're going to be talking about, covering here, will be, I think, relevant to that discussion of where at least we may be headed over the next couple of weeks. But before I do look at a forecast here, we've had massive changes over the last week. We talked about this big change in our weather, and we had really a week of summer-like weather here. And let me see if I can advance. There we go. And I just want to say a few things about the last week, because certainly from a meteorological and climatological point of view, it's important. And it may end up being a game changer in terms of the season. Again, Kurt talked about this. We had an unusually cool and damp and cloudy. It was and unquestionably, we had the numbers to show that many areas of Michigan during April, and I think I shared the number last week, it's 15 to 20 wet days during the month of April with precipitation. And that's some cases more than double what we typically see, but many clouds. Well, last week changed. And on the left-hand side here, this is a graphic or a series from Traverse City, but it's pretty representative. These are maximum and minimum temperatures indicated here in the blue bars. The top is the max temperature. The bottom is the minimum. Over the last 30 days from mid-April through the 16th. And this week really between the 8th and roughly the 14th or 15th was the core of this. We almost can call it a heat wave, I think, certainly for the first half of May. And this over on the right-hand side here, this is the core of that. And on this graphic here, the brown area in the middle here, that's what climate says, or climatology says, that's where we should be for max and min temperatures here for this location, for northwestern lower Michigan here during the second week in May. And you can obviously see some cases, the minimum temperatures almost were outside of that range, but we set a number of new records. On the right-hand side here, this is a graphic I just got from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, hundreds of records for maximum temperatures here set during the past week, and a lot of those occurred again in Michigan. Traverse City actually on a couple days went above 90 Fahrenheit. Very unusual for that time of the year. Again, it goes without saying this was an extraordinary week, and it was a whole week of that type of weather. Our mean temperatures, it turned out, for the week on the left-hand side here, and this is actually even after the core of that, but generally 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit above the normals. That's not easy to do statistically, but we see that. And you can see not just Michigan, but over the entire Midwest, upper Midwest, Corn Belt, all of that area, same thing. Now, precip was a very different story. It greatly depended on location. We talked about this last week at last week's briefing about some of the very locally heavy rain that fell. And you can see that here on this 1 week precipitation sum, but look at the variability in the state of Michigan. And there was an area here from Oceana County in the far western part. You can see this area with yellows and reds, enhanced areas here, eastward through Newaygo over towards Isabella, where they had almost stationary thunderstorms that dumped over the same area for several hours and ended up with 2 to more than 4 inches of rain in a really short time frame. You can see that little area, but that is the exception, without question. Statewide, much of the rest of the state, less than half an inch, and many areas saw less than a quarter of an inch. The precip, or the green areas down here across the southeastern lower, that precip came, of course, over the weekend on Saturday and Sunday. A lot of the western part of the state missed out on that. We also had some significant precipitation up in the Upper Peninsula and Upper Michigan as well. But for many areas, especially after such an extended wet period, it was the opposite, an extended dry period. And I'm going to say something about that in just a moment. But degree day totals, one last thing about that week, at least in terms of temperature. On the left-hand side here, these are seasonal base 50 growing degree day totals relative to the normal calendar. And you can see on the 8th, most of the state was a solid 1 to 2 calendar weeks behind normal because of all the persistent cool weather. And then 1 week later, look at the change, the color changes here. Now, most areas are at least several days to more than a week ahead. We rarely see changes that rapid occur in Michigan. And in May, we did some numbers and some statistics, and depending on location, I know for the northern lower, this is true, that the accumulation of degree days during that second week of May, it was the largest we have on record. We haven't had that many degree days. So literally with this warmth, an explosion of growth and development. And if you have perennials, you saw that apple went through its bloom stage literally within a few days, just but almost double the regular rate that happens. But again, all of that's due to this very, very warm period. Just as importantly, and where I'm going to finish here next, with the very, very warm temperatures against 80s for several days, and just as importantly, nighttime temperatures sometimes only in the 60s, and relatively low humidities during part of this full sunshine. We had 1.25 to 1.5 inches of potential evapotranspiration. That's atmospheric demand. So, and this is a number, again, to put it in perspective, that's a high number even for the peak of our irrigation season later on in July or August. Very, very, very unusual to see a number that high in the month of May, but we did again with so it wasn't just about the temperatures, it was also about the water demand, high evaporation rates. And one last one here, and I promise and I'll get to the forecast, but this is a soil moisture series. We don't look at this very often, but I think it's very, very a good illustration of the rapid change that we saw take place last week. This is from the Weather Station site in Hazlitt, and it's on a very, very coarse, well-drained soil. Sphinx loamy sand, for those of you who are familiar with that, fairly common soil across the South, but again, very, very well-drained. And what we see here at 3 levels, 2 inches, that's 5 centimeters. The blue is 4-inch level, and then the pink here is down at 8 inches. That's volumetric soil moisture, and you can see that on the left-hand side here, the units. And we had one of the last big rainfall events here on the 4th of May, just under 1 inch. And you can see the volumetric moisture responded right away to that, filled up rapidly. And we bring our volumetric up in some cases up above 20%. But then that warm, dry period began, and you can see this very rapid decline. Now, look at this steady drop off here. We go from basically above 20% volumetric moisture down, in some cases, down to less than 5 or 6% just in about a week and a half. Very, very, very rapid. And one more piece of perspective. There were a couple small events. It's interesting to note here, 700s and 1100s here. They basically had almost no impact at all. You can't even see it. That's also unusual to see that. It's not much water, but the soil just dried out so rapidly. This is under a grass-covered surface too, by the way, if you're interested. But one last thing here, field capacity for this soil, very, very, again, well-drained soil, only about 13%, something like that. It doesn't hold much water. It needs to be, needs to be certainly managed irrigation if possible. Wilting point down around 3%. That's what the official NRCS profiles suggest for this soil. But we went from being way above field capacity and drained upper limit here back in the beginning of May down to almost near wilting point within just a week and a half. Now, remember, this is the top of the soil, but again, a reflection and illustration for a well-drained soil, how rapidly things change. And I know you're out there and people are out there planting and digging, but it was just amazing to see how fast that drying took place. So again, another example of that. Well, where are we going? And I promised I would get finally to the forecast. The bottom line here, looking ahead, I think we're in a very active, unsettled pattern here. And in contrast to last week with summer and heat and dryness, we're going to be looking at a number of rainfall chances and likelihood of rain, and probably what will end up in much of the state, especially across the central and southern parts of the state, probably a very wet week. Again, thinking back about some of Kurt's comments earlier here, that's certainly relevant to where we are. This morning on the map, we have several frontal boundaries across the region, and it's important to note here that up aloft here, looking at the jet stream pattern, we're looking at a very pronounced southwest and northeast jet stream pattern here, and that these fronts, even though it shows them moving to the south and east, at least that's how they're drawn here, they're not making much progress because they're basically parallel to the upper air flow. So many of these frontal boundaries will have trouble making it farther south. And what that ultimately suggests is things are not going to change very fast here. Well, they will in terms of temperature, but not in terms of the overall weather pattern. So a lot of these frontal boundaries are going to consolidate and basically hang around in the area for several days instead of moving off and out of our hair or out of our way. They're going to be around here for at least the next 2 or 3 days. On the lower left-hand side here, you can see on the latest radar, recent radar loop, most of the precipitation that impacted the state yesterday with that low pressure system, that's all pulling off, and that is leaving and off on its way out to the Atlantic. And then the next weather system really of note here, you can see starting to get its act together out over the northern plains, and that's what we'll watch here by tomorrow. You can see some consolidation of low pressure up over the northern lakes, up over Lake Superior. And importantly for us, you can see a couple things with this. One is a very pronounced warm front that will pass through the state here beginning later today into tonight. And that is going to, I mentioned rapid change. You're going to definitely notice that even beginning today, but certainly tomorrow. And then there's one cold front here behind that. You can see across Wisconsin back into the southern plains. And then another area. This is the one ultimately up here in the northern plains that will bring a noticeable change here by the end of the weekend, but not until then. We've got several days of this frontal boundary being around, and because of that, a continuing threat of precipitation. So in terms of precip, we will see the threat of showers and thunderstorms beginning in western sections of upper Michigan here today, and then slowly but certainly spreading to the south and east and into into the eastern upper peninsula, maybe the far northwestern lower by overnight tonight, and then over most of the rest of the state tomorrow, especially across the northern 2/3 of the state, because again, the southeastern progression of this is going to be very, very limited. And again, most of the precipitation will be in the form of showers and thunderstorms. And temperature wise, I mentioned big changes today, noticeably warmer than it was yesterday. We will see some cases, we will see temperatures well into the 70s, and certainly in the central and south part of the state, even nearing 80, I think, in the south today, and a few degrees warmer than that tomorrow. We could see mid to upper 80s for high temperatures tomorrow in this warm sector of this system here, along with the threat of showers and thunderstorms. A couple of other things to note here. I've got another inset image down here. One is that it is possible, given the very, very warm and humid conditions across central and southern parts of the state, we could see some severe weather with this. Right now, the guess would be probably not. Hopefully that will not be the case, but something to keep an eye on just because there's so much warmth out there. There is the potential there. And the showers and thunderstorms will be more widespread in the north and more scattered in the south. So the best coverage will be across the northern areas. The other issue is we are going to see a noticeable increase in winds beginning today out of the west and southwest today, shifting around to the south. This particular image here shows wind speed and direction for tomorrow afternoon. And so what we likely are looking at is an insect transport event from taking insects from an area south of us, especially. You can see, if you look upstream, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Indiana, north and northeastward into Michigan. So these will be favorable conditions. Again, that will last from later today through tomorrow into probably early Saturday before the winds begin to change again. So something else to keep an eye on. Here's the map as of Saturday morning. And again, you can see that frontal boundary it's having trouble making it to the south and east. There will be another impulse that rides up this particular frontal boundary on Saturday, and the trend in our forecast guidance initially had called for most of the precip to move out during the day on Saturday, and then cooler and drier weather to move in for the late weekend. The latest guidance, unfortunately, is suggesting again another impulse moves up this front. You can see that here drawn in northern Indiana, and that strongly suggests, for at least for the southern part of the state, a long duration rain, shower, thunderstorm type of event across the southern part of the state for most of the day on Saturday. Greatest chance is the greatest threat. And I think this one for the southern part of the state, this will probably be the major one where we see the majority of the precip. We'll be looking at 1/4 to maybe 1/2 inch amounts tomorrow as the system moves across the state, but more or larger than that, 1/2 to maybe 1 inch totals are possible on Saturday, especially south. And then they will decrease as you go northward into certainly into the northern lower and UP. There we'll be only looking at scattered activity. So on Saturday, the greatest threat, and it's a very strong threat, I think, unfortunately, of rain, will be across the southern, basically half of lower Michigan. Finally, that precip, it persists on into Saturday night, Sunday evening. And by the day Sunday, we should see, probably still lingering clouds, but definitely cooler and drier weather moving in then for Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. After Saturday night, the next chance for significant precipitation, there will be some scattered rain, but mostly dry, probably coming late Tuesday or Wednesday of next week with the next weather system. So, and this map is a little discouraging, again, especially given where we are looking ahead here, but you can see at least 1 inch totals over much of Michigan forecast for the upcoming week, depending on, again, location. A lot for the northern part of the state. Most of this is coming over the next 1 to 2 days. For the southern part of the state, it comes in batches with a significant piece of it on Saturday. But you can see some areas even up near 2 inches of rain possible here. This is a potential on the upper end of what we might see. But again, what is likely to be a very active weather week with above normal precipitation once again for at least for the near term future. In the medium range forecast guidance, there is some persistence of this pattern. Not much to say about the upper air pattern here, but in general, what we're expecting is normal to below normal mean temperatures, and for a continued active storm track through the Midwest, which would lead to more frequent than normal chances for precipitation. We saw a lot of that, of course, during April, but the 6 to 10 days specifically calls for, again, that pointing towards a cooler and wetter than normal scenario. Now, it's also worth noting in the 8 to 14 day time frame, the outlook does call for the upper air pattern to even relax or become more zonal west to east than it has been. And as a result of that, it actually suggests a moderation in temperatures. Still normal to above normal precipitation totals, though, as we move into the very end of the month of May and into the beginning of June. I would also say important to note that the confidence, because of the lack of amplitude in the jet stream pattern, the confidence in this outlook is less than it is. So there's just more uncertainty with that, especially as we get out beyond a week and a half. But I think it is a good bet for much of the upcoming week. We are looking at that cooler and wetter after this one system goes through now here by Saturday, and then for much of the week next week. So summarizing, active and wetter the normal pattern. That's I think one of the messages, not the best of news here, but we do have more water coming, and also have, again, at least temporarily for the next couple of days, a return to very, very warm temperatures, but then cooling by the end of the weekend into next week. And as you can see, that is expected to continue probably for the next week to 10 days. And with that, I'll wrap up and move into transition and introduce next week's speaker for next Thursday. And that's going to be Scott Bales, who's going to be with us to talk about dry beans and planting and management. So that's, again, next Thursday, the 26th. And with that, I will turn it back over here to Christina and/or Phil. Thanks.